A former Navy SEAL returns to his family's old lodge, a place everyone else believes is too broken to ever stand again. Beside him are only a loyal dog, a few of his father's old tools, and a life so unsteady he no longer knows where to begin. No one believes that Soldier can save a place that worn down, and no one believes it could ever become a light for strangers again.
Are you sure
But sometimes
that
miracles do
shingle
not
is
arrive
straight?
through
It
grand
looks
events,
a little
only
crooked
through a
from
dry
down
roof,
here.
an open door at the right moment, and a heart that refuses to give up. This is a story about loss, faith, and the way a place that seemed finished can become a resting place for weary souls. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to support the channel. Help us reach 1,000 followers so we can keep telling more meaningful stories. And now, let's begin. By the time Elias Mercer turned off the main highway and took the narrower road that wound north along the lake, the sun had already dropped into that pale, slanting light peculiar to the upper country, where even brightness seemed touched by cold. The world around him was clean and sharp in a way that made lesser men feel refreshed. It did not refresh him. It only made everything easier to see. The truck rattled over broken gravel and old frost-heaved asphalt, its tires whispering through thin mud left behind by thaw. To his right, the water stretched long and steel blue, almost flat except where the wind dragged a shiver over its surface. To his left, pines stood dark and patient along the slope, their trunks rising like columns in some forgotten northern cathedral. Elias drove with both hands loose on the wheel, his shoulders straight out of habit, the posture of a man whose body still believed someone might be watching for weakness. Beside him sat Ranger. The dog was 6 years old, a German shepherd with a sable coat washed in cream, gray, and black, the colors deepening along his spine and softening near his chest and legs. His build was lean and powerful rather than oversized, all working muscle and control. A black harness with a faint dark red trim crossed his chest and shoulders, worn enough to show use, but still well kept. His ears stayed forward, catching sounds Elias never noticed until later, if at all. Ranger did not pant, did not fidget, did not whine. He watched the road ahead with the grave stillness of something that had long ago learned that movement did not always mean safety. Elias had known men less steady. At 35, he had the kind of face that looked carved by discipline rather than vanity. He was tall, just over 6 feet, built lean and compact, or with the efficient strength of someone who had spent years carrying weight because he had to, not because he wanted to be admired for it. His face was clean-shaven, exposing a square jaw and high cheekbones sharpened by fatigue and the northern light. His hair, dark brown and cut in a military style slightly longer than regulation, had grown just enough to suggest that no one was checking him anymore. His skin was fair beneath the weathering, marked by the wind-burned tint of cold country labor and years outdoors. His eyes, gray-blue and deeply set, had a quality people often misunderstood. At first glance, they looked distant. If someone held his gaze long enough, they realized the distance was not indifference. It was experience. He wore the same clothes he had worn for days now. An old olive-gray tactical combat shirt softened by use, lightly frayed at the cuffs and shoulders, a dark red thermal layer visible at the collar, worn combat pants in a faded earth and moss tone, military work boots scarred by hard surfaces, and an old field watch that still kept better time than most people. He had left the Navy weeks ago, or months, depending on which part of him was asked. Paperwork said one thing, his body said another. Every morning he still woke before dawn, with the instinctive certainty that something would soon be required of him. Every night he went to sleep disappointed by how little the world seemed to ask. Civilian life, as people called it, felt less like freedom than like being quietly removed from the map. He had tried not to come back here. That had been the truth of it. Returning to his parents' place had not been part of a hopeful plan. It had been what remained after other plans failed to become real. A security job in Spokane lasted 9 days. Warehouse work in Portland lasted 3 weeks, and left him with the numb fury of being told to slow down and smile more. A friend from the teams had suggested private contracting overseas, but the suggestion had landed in him like a door opening onto a room he no longer trusted himself to enter. So in the end, he had turned north, toward the old property, toward the house and the small roadside lodge his parents had built over a lifetime of ordinary effort. Toward the place he had once spent summers stripping beds, carrying firewood, fixing fence posts, and learning the difference between a repair done to impress someone and a repair done to last through winter. The first glimpse of the Mercer Lodge appeared through the trees without ceremony. No music in the heavens, no poetic snowfall. Just an old sign listing slightly to one side, its paint flaked thin by years of weather, the letters still legible if not proud. Beyond it sat the main house, and farther back, the row of rental rooms facing the lake. The sight struck him harder than he had prepared for. The buildings were still standing, but only in the stubborn way neglected things remain standing out of habit. And the porch rail sagged. One gutter hung crooked. The roofline over the east side of the lodge had a weary dip to it. Several window panes had gone cloudy. The place did not look dead. That would have been simpler. It looked abandoned by attention, which was worse. Death ended a thing. Neglect made it wait. Elias parked and cut the engine. Silence did not arrive cleanly. It came layered wind across the lake, the click of cooling metal, the faint creak of old wood somewhere ahead. Ranger's harness shifting as the dog rose. For a moment, Elias stayed where he was, staring through the windshield. His mother had once hung flower boxes under those front windows every May, though snow sometimes lingered in the shade until nearly June. His father had stood on that porch in rolled shirt sleeves with a coffee mug and a pencil behind one ear, always half in the middle of some fix, some improvement, some small battle against weather and time. Guests had come and gone with coolers, children, duffel bags, fishing rods, bad directions, and stories too long for polite company. There had been the smell of coffee, pine cleaner, old quilts dried in sun, bacon grease, damp boots by the door. Now there was only stillness. Ranger jumped down first. He landed lightly, then stood with his head lifted, taking in the property. He did not rush. He moved through the yard as if entering a memory that belonged partly to him and partly to someone else. At the porch steps he stopped, sniffed, then turned his head toward Elias with quiet expectation. "Yeah," Elias muttered, though he was not sure whether he meant, "Yes, wait, or I know." Inside, the house held cold the way some people hold resentment thoroughly and without spectacle. Elias unlocked the door with the old key from his father's tackle box and pushed it open. The air that met him smelled of cedar, dust, stale insulation, and the dry mineral scent of long unheated rooms. Not rot, not yet, but age was working. He moved slowly from room to room. The front room still contained the broad-backed couch his mother never managed to replace, a reading lamp with a bent shade, the stone hearth where winter fires had once snapped through whole evenings, The kitchen table was still there, too, scarred with knife marks and ring stains, one chair slightly wobbling in the same way it had when he was 16. On the wall hung a faded photograph of his parents in younger days, his mother smiling at the camera as if she had no fear of being seen clearly, his father not quite smiling but close enough to count. Elias looked away first. He crossed into the office nook that had doubled as a check-in desk for the lodge. The brass bell still sat on the counter. An old guest ledger lay beneath it, swollen slightly from damp years ago. He did not open it. Some relics asked too much. Behind him, Ranger padded down the hallway, nails ticking softly on the floorboards. The dog paused by the back door, then by the staircase, then by the entrance to the long row of guest rooms attached through the covered walkway. He lingered there, not agitated, not nervous, simply attentive, as if the silence beyond that threshold had its own shape. That was when Elias felt the first real shift inside himself. Not hope, not anything so dramatic. More like the uneasy sense that the house was not merely empty. It was waiting to see what kind of man had come back to it. Halfway down the guest corridor, he found the worst of it. A patch of stained ceiling, a warped baseboard, one cracked sink, peeling wallpaper in a corner room his mother had once called the good room because it caught morning light over the lake. He stood there longer than necessary, one hand on the door frame, looking at the bed stripped of linens, at the yellowed curtains, the dust lit gold by the westering sun. A strange thought came to him then, one so quiet he almost missed it. Not that the place could be restored, only that it had once mattered, and perhaps that was not the same thing as finished. A floorboard creaked sharply behind him. Elias turned fast, too fast, the movement all old reflex, only to find Ranger standing in the hallway, ears up, gaze fixed not on Elias, but toward the far wall near the linen closet. The dog let out a single low huff, then stepped sideways, avoiding a narrow strip of floorboards. Elias frowned and crouched. He pressed his palm to the wood, then shifted his weight carefully. Soft. Not collapse now soft, but soft enough to warn a man paying attention. He let out a breath through his nose. Good catch. Ranger looked at him once, then away, as though praise was unnecessary. That moment held longer than it should have. There was nothing mystical in it. No ghost in the boards, no voice from heaven. Just an old working dog refusing to trust a weak place before his human had noticed it. Still, something about it unsettled Elias in a way he could not name. It was the first time since returning that he did not feel entirely alone inside the problem. The feeling passed, or rather, it tucked itself somewhere behind his ribs and waited. By dusk, the cold had deepened. Elias gathered what little dry food he had brought from town, fed Ranger, and lit 2 lanterns because the power to part of the property no longer held steady. He ate, standing at the counter, barely tasting the canned stew he warmed, while Ranger settled near the front door with that grave, half-wakeful patience shepherds seemed born knowing. Later, with the house dark around him, except for the kitchen light, Elias went out to the storage shed. He did not know exactly why. Perhaps because stillness had become too loud, or perhaps because he had spent the whole afternoon circling memory and needed something solid under his hands. The shed door protested when he forced it open, and the smell hit him immediately. Oil, metal, old lumber, cold dirt, mouse-nibbled burlap, and the ghost of his father's aftershave carried impossibly through years. There, against the far wall beneath a canvas drop cloth, sat the workbench, and above it, Hanging on pegs exactly where they used to be was the old tool set. Hammer, chalk line, square, tape measure, hand saw, pry bar, wrenches, a coffee tin of assorted screws and nails, a spirit level worn smooth at the edges where his father's thumb had rested 1,000 times. Nothing expensive. Nothing precious in the obvious sense. Yet Elias stood utterly still. His father had not been a large man, but he had possessed that durable kind of strength that came from repetition and patience rather than bravado. He had taught Elias in terse, practical phrases. Measure twice. Don't patch what should be replaced. Or water always wins if you give it time. Finish what you start if someone else has to sleep under it. He had been gentler with buildings than with feelings, which in Elias's childhood had seemed a flaw. Now it felt like a kind of love translated into the only language the man trusted. Elias picked up the hammer. It fit. That was the dangerous part, not the memory, but the fit. As if his hand had been waiting all this time to remember a use for itself that had nothing to do with breaching doors or clearing rooms or carrying someone bleeding toward a helicopter under rotor wash. He turned the hammer over once. On the handle, nearly rubbed smooth, were his father's initials. Behind him, Ranger came to the threshold of the shed and sat. Outside, the last light drained from the lake, leaving the sky a long, bruised ribbon of violet and iron blue. The old lodge beyond the yard stood dim and crooked and patient, its windows dark, its sign leaning, its empty rooms carrying no witness but weather. Elias looked from the hammer to the buildings and back again. He did not suddenly become brave. He did not discover purpose in some cinematic rush. What came was smaller, harder, and more believable than that. A thought. If the roof over this place failed, it would fail all the way. If no one touched it, it would go by degrees, gutter, siding, beam, floor, another season, another winter, until one spring there would be nothing left but salvage and apology. He tightened his grip on the hammer. In the quiet, he could almost hear his mother's laugh from the porch, his father calling for the right socket wrench, the distant ring of the front bell when a guest came in out of the cold. Almost. Ranger gave a low, steady breath. Not a bark, not a warning. Just presence. Elias stood in the doorway of the shed and looked across the darkening yard at the lodge his parents had built with ordinary money, ordinary hands, and a kind of faith too humble to call itself faith. For the first time since returning, the emptiness inside him did not feel endless, only unfinished. He took the hammer back into the house. Morning came thin and silver over the lake, not with warmth, but with permission. Elias woke before dawn because his body still believed the day had to be met before it was seen. For a few disoriented seconds, he did not know where he was. Then the smell of cold cedar, dust, and old plaster settled over him again, and memory returned in pieces. The lodge, the dark hallway, the workbench in the shed, the hammer in his hand. Ranger lay near the front door, awake already, head lifted but motionless, the dog's amber-brown eyes reflecting the pale window light. He did not wag. He only watched Elias rise, as if measuring whether the man who had returned here yesterday was the same one standing now. Elias dressed in the same worn layers and stepped outside with a mug of black coffee he had brewed too strong out of habit, and the air bit the back of his throat. Frost still clung in the shadows beside the porch, though the sun had begun to push a weak gold over the far ridge. From the yard, the old lodge looked no kinder in daylight. If anything, morning made its faults more honest. The east gutter still leaned away from the roofline. A strip of paint had peeled from the porch trim in curling scales. One window on the far end was fogged white with age, blind to the lake beyond it. He stood there longer than he meant to, coffee cooling between his palms. It would take money he did not have, time he did not understand how to measure anymore. And even if he repaired it, then what? A man could spend months restoring a shell and still have no answer for what belonged inside it. The thought sat on him like wet canvas. Ranger moved down the porch steps and into the yard, nose low, tracing the old fence line. He paused once near a clump of dormant grass, and then trotted back toward the drive just as the sound of an engine drifted up the road. The vehicle that came around the bend was old enough to creak in sympathy with everything else on the property. A faded green station wagon, one headlight slightly clouded, rolled to a stop beside the leaning sign. For a moment, no one got out. Then the driver's door opened, and a small woman unfolded herself from behind the wheel with the deliberate care of someone who had learned how to move around pain without announcing it. Mabel Rowan was the sort of person old northern towns produced in quiet numbers and underestimated at their own risk. She was 74, narrow through the shoulders, with a frame that had grown fine and bird-boned with age but not fragile. Her hair, once chestnut perhaps, had gone to a clean white and was pinned into a low twist at the nape of her neck. Her face was lined in the honest places around the mouth, the corners of the eyes, along the brow, and her skin had the pale, weathered look of someone who had lived many winters without ever deciding they were an excuse. She wore a gray-blue cardigan over a dark plaid shirt, sturdy brown trousers tucked into practical boots, and a knitted scarf the color of dried cranberries looped once at her throat. Her eyes were bright and quick, a clear, pale hazel that missed very little. She looked from Elias to the house behind him and gave a small snort. "Well," she said, shutting the car door with more force than necessary, "you look exactly like a man who slept badly in a place full of ghosts." Elias almost smiled, which annoyed him enough to hide it. "Morning, Mabel. So you do remember me. That's encouraging." Her gaze shifted to Ranger, who had already come to stand beside Elias's left leg. "And there's the better half of the operation." Ranger did not move, but his ears tipped forward. Mabel had known his parents for years. She had not been family. Was not in the way people meant by blood or holidays, but she had occupied that practical third category common in small places, the person who showed up with soup when someone was sick, who borrowed sugar and returned it with pie, who knew everybody's business and was decent enough not to misuse it too often. Elias remembered her from childhood as a woman forever carrying something warm in a dish towel and opinions in equal quantity. "What brings you out?" he asked. She crossed her arms against the cold, though not dramatically. "Need a favor." He said nothing. Her mouth twitched. "That silence of yours is wasted on me, Elias Mercer. My roof's leaking over the back of the kitchen. Started after the thaw. I'd asked Dean Holloway, but his son moved him down to Idaho, and the man who replaced him charges like he's repairing cathedrals. I'm not a roofer." "No," she said. "You're your father's son, and I've seen you carry lumber since you were 12. They're close enough for a beginning." The refusal had already risen to his lips before he even knew he meant to say it. He did not want to fail in front of someone who still remembered his mother's laugh. He did not want to climb onto a roof and discover that memory and instinct were not skill. Most of all, he did not want to begin anything that might turn out to matter. "I'm not set up for that yet," he said finally. Mabel studied him with open impatience. "I'm not asking you to rebuild a church steeple. It's one corner of one old roof. If you tell me you can't do it after looking, I'll go back home and curse the weather by myself." Before Elias could answer, Ranger stepped away from him and crossed the porch. He went straight to Mabel, sat down at her boots, and looked up at her face with calm concentration. The woman's expression softened by a degree. "There," she said. "At least someone in this yard has manners." Elias glanced at the dog. Traitor." That earned him the smile he had almost allowed himself earlier. 20 minutes later he was in the shed again, pulling tools from the bench his father had used. The hammer, a pry bar, tape measure, flat bar, work gloves, a small bucket of roofing nails that had to be sorted for rust. He added a newer utility knife from his truck, a box of screws, and an old coil of tarp line. He was keenly aware of how incomplete the collection was. He was also aware that his father, had he been standing there, would have said the same thing he said about half the jobs in life. Use what you have first, then figure out what's missing. Mabel drove ahead in the station wagon. Elias followed in his truck, Ranger beside him this time with his head angled toward the window. Her house sat just over the next rise, modest and square, with a deep backyard, an old bird feeder, and a porch swing that moved slightly in the wind, though no one sat in it. The place looked cared for, but not effortlessly. The front steps had been recently shoveled, the flower beds trimmed back by someone who knew exactly how much work she could manage, and not an ounce more. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of tea leaves, lemon oil, and rain-damp plaster. A metal bowl sat on the table, catching water from a slow but regular drip near the back corner. Mabel pointed up with the concise irritation of a person offended by inconvenience, not intimidated by it. "There." Elias set down his tool bucket and looked. The stain in the ceiling had spread wide, but not dark enough to suggest years of neglect. New leak, then, or newly worsened. He checked the attic access, then the exterior line visible through the back window. The roof over that corner ran beneath an older maple branch. It's not large enough to tear shingles free on its own, but heavy enough to trap wet debris. "It's fixable," he said. Mabel nodded once, as if she had known the answer already and only needed him to hear himself say it. He found the ladder in her shed, older than he liked, but stable enough. The first climb tightened something low in his chest. Not fear exactly. Awareness. Roof lines were their own kind of honesty. Up close there was no room for vague intention. A thing either held or it didn't. The shingles near the back corner had buckled where trapped moisture and cold had done their patient work. 2 nails had backed out just enough to invite water under the edge. Beneath that, a strip of flashing had shifted. He crouched and got to work. At first every motion felt over-examined, as if part of him stood aside, judging the angle of his wrist, the placement of his weight, the sequence of each step. Then muscle memory older than military, older than grief began to return. His father on a ladder in summer heat. A boy below handing up tools. The smell of cut pine and tar paper. The irritated affection in a rough voice saying, "If you rush the line, you'll do it twice." Below him, Mabel moved in and out of the yard carrying things without being asked. A scrap bin, a cloth, a thermos she set on the porch rail. She did not hover. She did not praise. Which was perhaps why Elias kept working without resentment. Ranger circled the house once, twice, then stationed himself where he could see both the ladder and the back steps. Now and then he glanced up at Elias, not anxiously, but with the same focused steadiness he wore in every unfamiliar environment. He seemed to understand that this was work, and that work required a kind of silence, different from waiting. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to melt the last white seam along the north fence, Elias had removed the warped section, cleared the packed debris, reset the flashing, and replaced the damaged line with the materials Mabel had left over from an earlier repair. It was not elegant. It was solid. He was reaching to test the edge one final time when Ranger gave a single, sharp bark. Not loud, not frantic. Precise. Elias froze. He shifted his balance back a fraction of a second before the old ladder foot slid half an inch in the softened earth below. Nothing catastrophic, nothing dramatic enough for a story men told over whiskey. But enough. Enough that, had he leaned the wrong way, he might have come down hard onto the side path and broken something that would have made the rest of the season impossible. His pulse thudded once, heavy and immediate. From below, Mabel shaded her eyes and looked from the ladder to the dog and back again. I'm beginning to suspect that Animal has better judgment than most county officials. Elias climbed down slowly and reset the ladder on flatter ground. His hands were steady, but only because he insisted on it. Ranger walked over and stood close without touching him. For one strange, unguarded moment, Elias rested 2 fingers against the dog's harness strap and let himself feel what had almost happened. Not the fall. The cost of it. The ridiculous, ordinary fragility of being one slip away from ending the first useful thing he had done in months. He swallowed, straightened, and climbed back up. The work finished near midday. When he came inside, Mabel had set 2 mugs on the table and cut thick slices of bread from a loaf wrapped in a checked towel. She did not ask whether he wanted lunch. She assumed he needed it, and considered that sufficient consent. They sat at the kitchen table while the bowl remained dry beneath the once leaking corner. Up close, in full light, Mabel looked older than he remembered and stronger than most people half her age. Not in body, though that was there in the wiry set of her shoulders and the sure economy of her hands, and strong in the way some people become after enough years have stripped them of the luxury of pretending the world is fair. There was no softness in her that was not chosen. I appreciate it, she said, and slid an envelope across the table. Elias didn't touch it. Too much. She gave him a flat look. You haven't opened it? I don't need. Yes, you do. Her voice was not harsh. It was certain. You need groceries and gas and probably better screws than whatever your father left mummified in that shed. Don't be noble on my time. He exhaled through his nose and took the envelope. Then she leaned back slightly, cradling her tea in both hands, and her gaze drifted toward the dry ceiling overhead. It's a small thing, she said. Just one roof corner in one old kitchen. She smiled, but it carried wear. At my age, I'm not under any delusion I'll be doing much grand. No one's asking me to save the town, thank God. But a small dry place matters, more than people think. Elias said nothing. Mabel looked at him again, properly now. A person gets old enough, and they learn the difference between shelter and comfort. Comfort is nice. Shelter is holy. Something in his expression must have changed because her own softened. When my Harold was alive, she went on, we got caught in a storm outside Duluth one winter. Roads closed, snow coming sideways. We found a little boarding house with 1 room left and a pot of soup gone thin from feeding too many people. I still remember that room, not because it was pretty, because it kept us from spending the night in a ditch. She gave a quiet little shrug. Since then, I've never sneered at a humble roof. The room settled around those words. Elias looked down at his hands at the shallow crescent of grime beneath one nail, at the tiny cut near his knuckle where flashing had nicked him. A roof corner, a dry table, tea steaming in a kitchen that would not drip tonight. The scale of it was almost insultingly small beside the things he had once been trained to think mattered. And yet it sat inside him with more weight than several of those older things combined. He left Mabel's house in the late afternoon with the empty thermos she insisted he take, the envelope in his pocket, and a silence in his chest that no longer felt vacant. The road back to the lodge wound along the lake, bright now under a brittle sky. Ranger sat upright in the truck, ears forward, as if he too sensed some shift too slight to name. At the property, Elias got out and stood facing the old row of rooms. The place looked no less damaged than it had that morning. No miracle had passed over it. The windows were still clouded, the sign still leaned, the east roof still dipped. But now another image stood beside that one in his mind. A kitchen kept dry by a few hours of work. An old woman sitting down at her own table without moving bowls under drips. Nothing grand, nothing glorious. But he walked slowly to the porch of the main house, then turned and looked across the yard toward the lodge his parents had built board by board. If one repaired room, one sound roof, one lit porch could spare somebody a bad night, what could a whole place do? The thought did not arrive like ambition. It came like recognition. Ranger climbed the steps and sat beside him. The evening light caught the dark line of the dog's back and the faint red trim of his harness. Elias rested one forearm on the porch post and kept looking at the buildings as if they might answer if given enough time. They did not. But for the first time, he found himself wondering not whether the place could be saved, only what it might mean if it was. The next morning did not arrive with revelation. It arrived with frost silvering the porch rail and the kind of practical cold that made breath visible and decisions feel more expensive than they had the night before. Elias Mercer stood on the front steps of the main house with a legal pad balanced against one palm, staring across the yard at the old lodge as if the building might, by sheer irritation, explain itself. The page in his hand held a short, ugly list, written in block letters that looked more like field notes than plans for civilian life. Roofline east wing, 3 broken windows, water damage guest room 4, check plumbing, check power, unsafe floor section hall. Under that, he had written a second list. Cash on hand. What can be salvaged? What will kill the whole thing if ignored? Nothing about the list felt noble. And he appreciated that. Nobility had a way of making men careless. Behind him, Ranger pushed through the screen door with the quiet firmness of an animal who considered closed spaces temporary inconveniences. The German shepherd stood beside him in the morning light, sable coat dark along the spine and lighter where the cream of his chest caught the sun. His harness, black with the faint dark red edging, had been brushed clean after yesterday's work. He looked out at the lodge, then up at Elias. "You don't get to vote," Elias muttered. Ranger held his gaze a second longer than necessary, then turned back toward the guest rooms. That irritated Elias because it felt too much like agreement. He spent the first hours of daylight walking the property with a tape measure, flashlight, pry bar, and a pencil tucked behind one ear the way his father used to do without thinking. He checked the porch supports, tested window frames, pressed at siding gone soft from years of weather, and wrote down what he found in curt, unsentimental phrases. Some of it was better than expected. The stone foundation of the main house was still sound. 2 of the guest rooms needed mostly surface work. The central hallway roof was tired, but not yet surrendered. Other parts were worse. One sink line had likely burst and been left. A back corner of the laundry room smelled of trapped damp and old insulation. The east side dip in the roof had the patient menace of a problem that would wait politely until the worst possible day to become a disaster. Every answer created 3 more questions, and every question seemed to end with money. By late morning, he was standing in the old office nook of the lodge, staring at the dead register shelf and trying to imagine strangers walking through that front door again, when the sound of a truck pulling into the yard broke his concentration. Around the vehicle was a faded white pickup with an equipment rack over the bed and a ladder tied down with blue rope. The man who got out carried himself with the same economy Elias distrusted in himself. No wasted gestures, no theatrical toughness, just the posture of someone who had spent years doing necessary things without expecting applause. Wes Gannon was 62 and looked as though age had filed him down to the useful parts. He was not tall, maybe an inch under 6 feet, but broad through the chest and dense in that compact, work-worn way older tradesmen sometimes were. His hair had gone mostly silver and was cut short. A day's worth of gray stubble shaded a hard, weather-shaped jaw. Deep lines bracketed his mouth and cut across his forehead, but his eyes were alert and pale under heavy brows. He wore a brown work jacket over a dark red and black flannel shirt, heavy canvas pants, worn boots, and a leather belt carrying tools with the casual finality of a man who believed in being prepared because he had once learned the cost of not being. His wife had died 12 years earlier, people said. A winter wreck on black ice. Since then, Wes had become even less patient with carelessness than he already was. He shut the truck door and looked up at the lodge. "Looks worse than when your father was pretending not to sell it." "That encouraging, is it?" Elias asked. Wes huffed once, the closest he generally came to amusement. "Encouragement is for preachers and bad coaches. You asked me to look at the wiring. I'm here." He had not actually asked, not exactly. The evening before, after too much thinking and too little certainty, Elias had gone by Wes's place and said he needed an honest opinion. Wes had grunted, told him morning, and shut the door before courtesy could make either of them uncomfortable. Now the older man stepped past him into the lodge, as if the building belonged to scrutiny more than memory. "Batum." Ranger rose from where he had been lying near the doorway and approached without rush. Wes glanced down. "Still got the dog with the courtroom stare," he said. Ranger sat. Wes nodded once. "Fair enough." The inspection lasted nearly 2 hours. Wes checked outlets, exposed junctions, the old panel in the service closet, light fixtures that had not held current in years, and the exterior line running from the pole. He spoke very little while working, but when he did, his words came in the exact tone of a man driving nails. Direct, final, slightly annoyed by softness. "This part can stay. This part needs replacing. This was done stupidly even when it was new." He explained enough for Elias to follow, not enough to flatter him. That, oddly, made Elias respect him more. Men who knew what they were doing rarely needed to perform knowledge at full volume. At last, Wes straightened from the panel and wiped his hands on a rag. "You want the truth, or the kind people use when they don't want to discourage a bad idea?" "Truth. You can make a few rooms safe." His eyes traveled across the corridor, then toward the far end where sunlight angled through dusty glass. "You cannot open this whole place tomorrow unless you've suddenly inherited money and good sense in equal amounts." "I'm not trying to open the whole place tomorrow." Wes looked at him more directly then, and something in his face shifted. Not warmth, exactly, but a tightening of attention. Then what are you trying to do? The question should have been easy. It wasn't. Elias found himself looking past Wes toward the front desk, where his mother had once checked in couples on fishing weekends and truckers half asleep from mountain roads. What was he trying to do? Save the lodge? Save himself? Honor his parents? Avoid becoming a man who drifted until somebody else decided what he was worth? I don't know yet, he said, and hated how true that sounded. Wes did not mock him for it. Good, he said. Men get dangerous when they name things too quickly. That afternoon, word traveled faster than Elias would have liked. By the time he drove into town for screws, sealant, and a replacement hasp for the back supply room, 2 people had already asked whether he was really reopening Mercer Lodge, and one had laughed before he answered. He found himself saying the same thing each time. Not reopening, just fixing. No one believed that. Small towns had a talent for hearing the shape of hope before the person carrying it was willing to admit it out loud. The hardware store sat at the corner of Main and Alder, a squat building with sun-faded paint, a bell over the door, and a smell so dense with oil, cut wood, fertilizer, and cold iron it might have been used to preserve memory. Behind the counter stood Gideon Pike. Gideon was somewhere in his mid-40s, maybe a little older. A broad-shouldered and clean in the way prosperous men often were, never flashy, but composed. His dark hair, trimmed neatly and brushed back, showed a few early silver threads at the temples. He was clean-shaven, with a sharp mouth, and a face built from decisive lines rather than softness. He wore a charcoal work jacket over a dark knit sweater, dark pants, and boots too expensive to be called practical by men who had ever truly ruined a pair. He was not handsome in the careless way some men were. He was precise, deliberate, the kind of man who could make civility sound like a measured investment. He owned Pike Motor Stop out near the highway turnoff. Newer rooms, brighter sign, vending machines that worked, coffee strong enough to be remembered. Elias had known him distantly in school, though known was too generous a word. Gideon had always seemed like the boy most likely to become an adult, who called losses by their market value. When Elias stepped to the counter with his basket, Gideon looked at the items, then at Elias. Storm prep? He asked. Repair work. At the old lodge? Elias set the basket down. That everybody's business now? Gideon smiled, but without malice. In towns this size, almost by law. He rang up the first box of screws with smooth efficiency. You really thinking of bringing that place back? Thinking of keeping it from falling apart. That's not the same thing. Gideon scanned the sealant, then leaned one forearm on the counter. Listen, Elias, I'm not trying to be unkind, but sentiment is the most expensive building material there is. Elias said nothing. Gideon took that for permission to continue. The road gets less traffic than it did 20 years ago. Travelers want easy check-in, reliable heat, and a place to charge a phone. They don't want a half-repaired memory with a view. The words landed with more force than Elias wanted them to. Yet not because Gideon was cruel, because he was making the kind of argument adulthood respected. And if people need more than that? Elias asked before he could stop himself. Gideon's brows lifted just slightly. Need what? Elias did not answer. For the first time in the exchange, something unreadable crossed Gideon's face. You're serious, he said quietly. Elias took the bag, but before he could step away, Ranger, who had followed him inside, and until now remained by the door, stood and walked toward the old bulletin board near the exit. The board had not been cleared in years. Faded church notices, fishing permits, snowmobile maps, and handwritten room ads curled beneath thumbtacks and dust. Ranger stopped in front of one yellowing card and stared at it. Not sniffed, not nosed. Stared. The store went strangely still around that small act. Elias crossed over, more unsettled by the dog's focus than he could explain. The card was old, one corner curled inward. In faded blue ink, beneath a date from years ago, someone had written, "Room at Mercer Lodge saved my life in February. Don't tear it down. R.L." For a second, Elias forgot where he was. The writing was ordinary, the sort of note a tired traveler or lonely drifter might tack up on impulse. It should not have mattered. Yet something in the crude sincerity of it reached straight past his guarded mind into whatever part of him still responded before it reasoned. Behind him, Gideon came closer. "I remember that," he said. "Some trucker or hunter left it after your mother let him stay when the roads shut down." He shrugged faintly. "She kept feeding people half the county told her would never pay her back." Elias looked at the card again. "Room at Mercer Lodge saved my life. Not in a metaphorical way. Not in the language people used when they wanted to sound grateful without naming their need. Just simple, blunt, almost embarrassed by itself. His ranger sat beneath the board as if the matter had been presented and required no argument. When Elias turned, Gideon was watching him with a different expression now. Not convinced, certainly not converted, but less dismissive than before. "You always this superstitious with the dog?" Gideon asked. "No." "Pity. Would have made high school more interesting." Elias let out a breath that almost counted as a laugh. By the time he returned to the lodge, the light had shifted westward, laying long bars of gold across the yard. He unloaded the supplies onto the kitchen table of the main house and added prices to his notepad with a care bordering on severity. Cash on hand. Purchase cost. How long he could keep pretending he was simply fixing things without naming the larger shape of it. Wes's verdict still sat in his head. Gideon's logic sat beside it. Then there was the note. That note. But he went out to the front of the lodge and stood beneath the old sign. The wood post was cold under his hand. Ranger moved a few yards ahead and then turned back toward him. Elias looked at the dark windows, the office desk, the line of rooms that had once held fishermen, families, truck drivers, salesmen, widows traveling alone, boys coming home too late, girls leaving too early, people with money, people without enough, people just needing one good night and not asking the world for much else. He could not make it a real business. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way Gideon meant. He did not want bright vacancy lights and laminated rates and a smiling lie about comfort. He wanted what? Something smaller, tougher, more necessary. A place where a person could stop without being made to feel like a problem. A place where a bed, dry walls, and coffee in the morning might count for more than polish. A place that did not ask too many questions before letting a stranger come in out of the cold. The answer, when it came, did not feel like ambition. It felt like a line settling into place. He would not try to reopen Mercer Lodge as if the years in between could be erased. He would repair it piece by piece, room by room, safe first, useful next, honest always. Some people would pay, some would pay less. Some, if they truly had nowhere else and needed one night, would owe him nothing but decency. It was not a business plan. Gideon would have called it suicidal. Wes would probably call it naive if he were in a charitable mood. But it was, for the first time, an actual plan. Ranger came back to stand at his side, pressing the warm line of his shoulder briefly against Elias's leg. Elias looked down at him. "This is a stupid idea." Ranger blinked once, calm and unimpressed. The wind moved over the lake, carrying the clean, mineral scent of cold water and pine. Somewhere far up the road a truck passed and was gone. As the evening deepened, Elias stayed where he was until the windows of the lodge reflected the first pale hints of dusk, and when he finally turned back toward the house, the decision went with him. Not grand, not triumphant, but solid enough to carry. He would fix what he could, and he would make the place mean something again. Once Elias Mercer made the decision, the world did not reward him with momentum. It rewarded him with arithmetic. He began each morning at the kitchen table in the main house with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm too quickly and a legal pad crowded by numbers that seemed to mock him no matter how neatly he arranged them. Nails, flashing, window glazing, insulation, pipe fittings, fuel, sealant, light fixtures. Bedding, eventually, if he ever reached a point where a room could hold a stranger with dignity. Every line item looked small alone. Together, they rose like a wall. Outside, the old lodge remained what it had been the day before. Weathered, watchful, too damaged to trust, and too stubborn to collapse quickly. Elias no longer stood staring at it from a distance. He had moved past that stage. Now he worked. Or rather, and he tried to work in two directions at once and discovered that exhaustion had 1,000 practical faces. During the day, he took repair jobs around the county's small ones, mostly the kind that sat at the bottom of other men's lists. A warped back door swollen from thaw, a leaning fence line. Porch steps with one board gone soft underfoot. A section of gutter sagging away from a farmhouse. A shed roof patched so many times it looked like a quilt assembled by an argument. These jobs did not pay well, but they paid faster than hope. At dusk, he came back to the Mercer property and spent whatever strength remained on the lodge. He stripped old wallpaper where damp had turned the seams brittle. He pulled warped trim, reset latches, scraped flaking paint, and marked off the rooms that might be made safe first. His hands developed the split, raw look of a man living half in cold water and half in old wood. He slept more heavily, but not better. A ranger adapted without complaint. The German shepherd rode with him from job to job, climbed out when invited, waited when told, and developed an uncanny talent for locating exactly the weakest place in any structure before Elias found it himself. At 6 years old, the dog had settled into the kind of disciplined maturity that looked almost solemn on him. His cream-gray-black coat gathered dust by day and the scent of cedar shavings by night. His amber eyes missed very little. Sometimes Elias felt that Ranger had become the only witness to the whole strange undertaking, a pair of steady eyes marking each small victory and every private doubt without ever turning either into shame. In the second week, work came from Mabel Rowan first, because Mabel considered herself entitled to run a campaign without asking permission. "You did my roof," she told him when she appeared one afternoon by his truck while he was loading scrap lumber. "That buys you gossip in your favor for at least 10 days. I didn't realize there was a conversion rate." "There is for everything," she said, "especially in small towns." From her, word spread not as praise. She would never have insulted him with something that theatrical, but as recommendation. He was reliable. He did not overtalk. He did not leave halfway through a job. That was enough to bring him the kind of people who had something broken and not quite enough money to attract better company. One of those jobs took him to a farmhouse south of the lake, where he spent 6 hours replacing porch boards for a retired school bus driver who insisted on telling stories while Elias worked, and paying him in exact cash, folded so crisply it looked ironed. Another sent him to a weather-beaten rental cabin whose owner wanted the front steps rebuilt before summer fishing season. Another had him bent beneath a sink in a trailer, while a toddler watched from the hallway with solemn suspicion. And Ranger lay in the yard pretending not to notice a hen trying to challenge his dignity. No glory, no transformation, just labor. Yet even that began to alter him, not in some dramatic redemption that would have embarrassed him if named aloud. More quietly than that, he started sleeping with the heavy animal fatigue of a man whose body had again been given a use. He started noticing the satisfaction that came from completing something visible. Not everything worth doing had to be epic. Some things mattered because a widow could step safely onto her porch tomorrow, because rain would stay outside where it belonged, because a stranger's sink would no longer flood a cheap floor. The money, however, remained insulting, but he spent it almost as quickly as he made it. By the 3rd week, he had learned the specific misery of standing in the hardware store with a basket that held what he needed and a wallet that argued for less. He began salvaging more aggressively from the property hinges from one room to save another, intact boards from an old interior partition, usable hardware from cabinets nobody would miss. Some evenings he worked by lantern light, too stubborn to stop and too tired to think clearly. Those were the nights he became dangerous. It was on one of those evenings that Noah Pike first appeared. Elias was in guest room 2, trying to pry loose a section of water-warped baseboard without splitting the plaster beside it, when Ranger rose from where he had been lying in the doorway and let out a low sound. Not a threat, not alarm, more like a notice. Elias turned. A young man stood in the hall just outside the room, hands shoved into the pockets of a gray hoodie, shoulders half slouched as though he had spent enough years being unwelcome that he no longer approached any door straight. He was maybe 19, built in that unfinished way some boys carried into early manhood, tall enough to suggest where he was headed, not yet broad enough to fill it out. His hair was sandy brown, too long over the forehead, flattened on one side as if he'd taken off a cap and run his hand through it instead of bothering with a mirror. A faint bruise-yellow shadow sat beneath one eye, not fresh, but not old enough to ignore. His face still held some softness at the jaw, but there was tension in his mouth that belonged to someone who expected criticism before conversation. But he wore work pants with one knee gone pale from wear, and boots that had seen more mud than polish. Ranger watched him carefully, but did not stand between him and Elias. "You got a habit of sneaking into other people's buildings?" Elias asked. The boy glanced at the dog first, then at Elias. "Door was open." "That's not an answer." A quick flash of defensiveness crossed the young face, then disappeared beneath something closer to embarrassment. "Name's Noah." "Pike?" The boy's mouth twitched. "Yeah, everybody says it like that." Noah Pike was Gideon's nephew by his mother's side, though the family resemblance was mostly an argument in bone structure. Gideon's face looked finished, sharpened by deliberate choices. Noah looked as though life had caught him mid-construction and then wandered off. Elias remembered him vaguely from town, different jobs for brief periods, a reputation for not lasting, whispers of school left unfinished. Not a criminal, just a boy the town had already grown tired of waiting for. What do you want, Noah?" He shifted his weight. "Heard you were fixing the place." His gaze moved around the room, taking in the stripped walls, the stack of salvaged trim, the window frame Elias had already sanded clean. "Figured you might need somebody to haul stuff." "Why?" That seemed to catch him. Because you do? Then, after a beat, because I need work. Honesty, when it came from the young, often sounded ruder than deceit. Elias respected that more than he wanted to admit. Ranger stood and crossed the room. Noah stiffened, but held still as the dog approached, sniffed his hand once, then sat down at his boots with complete indifference. Something unguarded flickered in the boy's face. Relief, maybe. Maybe just surprise at not being rejected on first contact. You good with ladders? Elias asked. Mostly. That's not good enough. I can learn. Elias looked at him a long moment. He should have said no. Bringing somebody else into the work meant slowing down, explaining, taking responsibility for mistakes that would not be his alone. He had enough of that already, but he also had trim to strip, windows to reglaze, supplies to move, floors to clear, and only 2 hands. You show up at 7 tomorrow, he said. If you're late, don't come at all. Noah blinked. That's it? That's the offer? The boy nodded once. Too fast. Yeah, okay. He left almost immediately after that, as if staying longer might cause the chance to vanish. Ranger watched him go, then looked up at Elias. Don't start, Elias muttered. The next morning, Noah arrived at 6:53, carrying a thermos with no lid, and an expression so carefully blank, it revealed how badly he wanted not to mess this up. The bruise under his eye had darkened slightly in the cold light. Elias didn't ask about it. Some boys carried explanations like open wounds and some like locked drawers. Noah looked like the second kind. The first hour went badly. He held the ladder wrong. He stacked salvaged boards in a place that blocked the doorway. He used finish screws where Elias wanted structural ones. Twice he moved before being told, once when he should not have, and once when he should have done the opposite. Yet beneath the clumsiness there was effort, real effort, strained and awkward but sincere. He listened hard. He flushed when corrected. He did not sulk. By noon, they had stripped 1 room fully and hauled a truck bed's worth of debris to the burn pile. Elias was in the supply room at the rear of the lodge, sorting usable hardware from junk, while Noah swept out the narrow service hall. Ranger had been moving in and out all morning, restless in that contained, deliberate way he had when some detail in the environment bothered him before it announced itself. Suddenly the dog stopped at the threshold of room 3 and stared upward. No sound. No warning bark. Just absolute stillness. Elias felt the change before he understood it. He stepped into the hall and saw Noah lifting a long, splintered board from the floor directly beneath a sagging section of ceiling that had looked stable from the ground. "Drop it," Elias said sharply. The boy froze. A beat later, a fist-sized piece of damp plaster cracked free and hit the floor exactly where Noah's head would have been if he had taken 1 more step. Dust burst up around his boots. Noah went white under the freckles. Ranger remained staring at the ceiling until the last bit of powder settled. For a second, none of them moved. Then Noah let out a breath that shook despite him. "I didn't even touch it." "No," Elias said, voice flat because it was easier than honest. "You didn't." Ranger came to stand beside Noah, pressed lightly against his leg once, then turned and walked away as if the matter had been settled. That moment changed something invisible in the day. Not because it was miraculous, because it was close. Close enough to leave a taste in the mouth. Close enough that both Elias and Noah worked the rest of the afternoon with a different kind of attention. The lodge was not sentimental ruin. It was a structure with moods, weaknesses, and rules. Respect them, or pay for arrogance. Later, while they hauled debris outside, Noah glanced toward Ranger and said, too casually, "He always do that?" "Usually before I'm smart enough to notice." "Huh." That was all. But Elias heard the reverence under it. The days developed a rhythm after that. Mornings on paid jobs when he had them, afternoons and evenings at the lodge. Noah started helping with both when the work was local enough and the homeowner didn't mind an extra pair of hands. He learned quickly once his nerves stopped tripping him. He was good at carrying loads without complaint, was better at remembering instructions than Elias had expected, and unexpectedly patient with repetitive tasks like scraping old paint or sorting hardware. He was also 19 in ways no amount of hardship erased. He talked too much when tired. He forgot where he set tools. Once he nearly fed Ranger a screw by accident while eating crackers with greasy fingers, and got a look from the dog so offended it nearly made Elias laugh. Weeks passed in the humble, stubborn fashion of all real progress. Room 1 got a sound window, clean walls, and a floor stable enough to trust. Room 2 followed more slowly, but ended with a bed frame repaired, a lamp rewired under Wes's sharp supervision, and curtains washed free of years. Elias did not permit himself pride. Pride got sloppy. But one evening, standing in the doorway of the first completed room, while the last of the western light lay across the clean floorboards, he let himself feel something close to relief. 2 rooms. Not a lodge. Not a future. But 2 rooms that would not embarrass the dead or fail the living. Noah stood beside him with his hands in his hoodie pocket. "Looks like somebody might actually stay here." "Maybe." "You think they will?" Elias looked past the room toward the lake, where the surface had gone copper beneath the dying sun. "I think if the world gets difficult enough, most people are willing to be grateful for less than they expected." Noah absorbed that silently, which for him counted as thought. Ranger came into the room, circled once, and lay down in the center of the floor, as if claiming it on behalf of all future exhaustion. Outside, the evening settled over the old Mercer property in layers of cold light and wood smoke. The sign still leaned. The gutters still needed work. Half the place remained one hard wind away from reminding them how unfinished everything was. But 2 rooms stood ready, and for the first time since he had come home, Elias felt that the place was no longer merely surviving his return. It was beginning, very slowly, to answer it. By the time the 2nd room was ready, Elias Mercer had stopped measuring progress in hope. He measured it in hinges that no longer stuck, in window latches that caught cleanly, in floorboards that held his weight without complaint. He measured it in the smell of bleach fading from old wood, in folded blankets stacked where dust had ruled a month before, in the way Noah Pike had begun to carry things with purpose instead of apology. Hope was too slippery to be useful. Work, on the other hand, could be counted. That evening the sky lowered early over the lake, not storm dark, but dense with that northern gray that made the world feel briefly undecided. Elias stood in the doorway of room 2 with a rag in one hand and looked over what they had finished. 2 beds, not matching but solid. A small table between them. Curtains washed clean enough to let in light without advertising every year they had survived. A lamp wired safely under Wes Gannon's direction. A floor that would not betray a tired stranger in the middle of the night. It still looked humble. More honest than pretty, more repaired than renewed, which, he thought, might be enough. Noah leaned against the doorframe behind him, trying too hard to look casual. At 19, he had the unsettled shape of a young man who had outgrown one life without yet growing into another. He was all elbows and quick glances, sandy brown hair falling into his eyes when he forgot to shove it back, a bruise yellow memory still faint beneath one eye from some past trouble he had not explained. His hoodie sleeves were pushed unevenly to his forearms, exposing thin wrists roughened by new work. He had started to carry himself differently in recent weeks, not with confidence exactly, but with the first fragile outline of usefulness. "You think it needs anything else?" he asked. Elias glanced around once more. "It needs people less picky than your uncle." That got the corner of Noah's mouth to twitch. Outside, Ranger crossed the front yard at an even pace, head low, moving through the dusk as if he belonged to it. The German shepherd's cream-gray-black coat caught the last thin light along his back, and the dark red edging of his harness flashed once before the shadows took it. He had made a habit of checking the property in the evening, pausing at the drive, the side path, the back utility steps. It looked almost like patrol. Elias tried not to think about why that comforted him. They closed up the rooms and went into the main house. Supper was leftover stew thickened beyond elegance and bread Noah had bought from town because Mabel had told him, with brutal generosity, that if he was going to eat around working men, he should learn the difference between food and packaged regret. The boy took the insult like a compliment. Elias suspected that was how one survived Mabel Rowan. They ate mostly in silence, not the hostile kind, the earned kind. Ranger lay near the stove, one ear angled toward the door, eyes half-lidded but alert. The house had begun to sound less vacant lately. Even quiet had changed character. There were the settling noises of wood adjusting to evening cold, the occasional clink of a spoon against a bowl, Noah's chair scraping when he shifted too hard, Ranger's soft exhale. Small sounds, domestic sounds. Elias was not used to how much they could affect a room. After supper, Noah left for town in his old truck, promising to come early the next morning if Elias needed him. Elias grunted something that passed for agreement. He cleaned the bowls, checked the supply list for the 10th time, then stood for a long while at the window over the sink, staring toward the darkened outline of the lodge. Two rooms, and a foolish idea. And he had already begun to set rules in his mind, though he had told no one all of them yet. If someone truly needed a place, one night free was possible. If they could pay, they would pay something, even if only a little. If they could not pay in money, there were other currencies, sweeping, splitting wood, helping mend, helping carry. This place would not become somewhere people hid from life until it forgot them. It would be somewhere they caught their breath and kept moving. It was a rule he understood in his bones, because he knew too well what happened when men mistook shelter for surrender. The light over the porch had not worked when he first returned. Wes had rewired it 2 days before, with enough insults to count as affection. Elias had not turned it on yet. He kept telling himself there was no reason to invite attention before he was ready. Now, standing alone in the kitchen, he looked out at the old lodge, at the black windows reflecting a dim slice of sky, and felt something gather in his chest. Not certainty, not courage, just a quiet refusal to wait any longer for conditions to become perfect. He crossed the room, took his jacket, and stepped outside. The cold had sharpened. The lake was a sheet of dark metal beyond the road, the trees along its edge massed into one shadow. He walked to the porch of the lodge, climbed the 2 worn steps, and stood with his hand resting on the switch plate just inside the office entry. For a second he thought of his mother checking lamps before dusk, of his father stepping out to make sure the sign could be seen from the road. Not memory like a wound this time. Memory like company. Then he turned the light on. It came alive with a small, steady glow, nothing grand, just a warm yellow spilling across the porch boards and the front gravel. But against the gathering dark, it looked startlingly human. Like an answer. Like proof that the place had not given up its right to be seen. Ranger came to stand beside him. Elias did not look at the dog. He kept his eyes on the light. "Well," he said under his breath to no one who could have objected. "There it is." A pair of headlights appeared far down the road, drifted past, then slowed. Elias, who had returned to the house and was sorting old invoices into a box for burning, noticed the glow crossing the window. He went still. The lights kept going. Then, after a stretch long enough to feel deliberate, they disappeared around the bend. He told himself that was that. But Ranger had already risen. The dog moved to the front door, not barking, not pacing. He simply stood there with an intensity that made Elias put the box down without thinking. Then came the sound, a car engine straining, coughing once, twice, followed by silence from the road. Elias opened the door. The night seemed to listen back. He grabbed his coat and flashlight, and by the time he reached the porch, Ranger was already down the steps, waiting. Together they crossed toward the drive, just as a figure emerged from the dim line where the road met the yard. It was a woman, maybe in her late 40s or early 50s, tall enough to appear almost severe at first glance, though the illusion softened when she drew closer. She wore a dark, quilted coat, zipped to the throat, jeans streaked at the cuffs with road slush, and boots that had once been practical but were losing the argument. Her hair, a deep brown threaded with early silver, had been pulled into a loose knot that had partly fallen, leaving strands blown across her cheek. Her face was narrow and fine-boned, her skin pale from long hours behind glass and winter light. There were tired crescents under her eyes and a firm set to her mouth that suggested she had spent many years not asking anyone for more than she could justify. Yet what reached Elias first was not pride, it was restraint, and the kind born of having needed help before and knowing how much it cost to ask for it. Her hands were bare despite the cold. She held her car keys too tightly. "Sorry," she said, breath visible between them. "My car died about half a mile back. I thought I could make it to town." Her gaze flicked to the lit porch, then to him, then down to Ranger. "I saw the light." Elias let his flashlight dip. Behind the fatigue, she was composed in a deliberate, brittle way, like glass that had survived pressure by refusing to bend. He had known that look in soldiers, nurses, widows, truckers, anyone who had gone too far on their own momentum and only stopped when mechanics or weather forced them to. "Do you need a tow?" he asked. "In the morning, probably." Her laugh was quick and humorless. "Tonight I mostly need not to be sitting in a dead car by the road." Ranger stepped forward once, slowly, and the woman did something Elias noticed immediately. She did not flinch. She did not reach either. She simply looked at the dog as if recognizing another creature accustomed to staying alert past the point of comfort. "I'm Claire Donnelly," she said. "I'm not trying to impose. I can pay." Claire Donnelly. The name settled into the air without ceremony. Elias guessed 49, maybe 50. A face that would have been called striking when younger, though the years had turned it into something better clear-eyed, self-contained, marked by endurance instead of softness. Whatever had shaped her had not made her timid. "You're not imposing," he said, though he felt the unfamiliarity of the sentence as he spoke it. "I've got a room." For a brief second, something passed through her expression so quickly he almost missed it. Not relief, exactly. More dangerous than that. the loosening that came when a person realized they did not have to hold themselves upright for one more hour. "Just one night," she said. "That's generally how nights work." To his surprise, that earned a real smile. Tired, but real, he led her to the lodge, Ranger walking slightly ahead with the easy gravity of a host who had never been told the job belonged to him. Inside, Elias opened room 1 and switched on the lamp. Warm light filled the small space, touching the clean blankets, the repaired floor, the plain table. Claire stood in the doorway for a moment, as if she could not quite reconcile what she had expected from the dark road with what she had found. "It's perfect," she said softly. It wasn't, but he understood what she meant. He brought her an extra blanket and showed her where the washroom was, where the kettle could be found in the main house if she wanted tea, where she could leave her boots to dry. He did not ask why she was traveling alone. He did not ask where she had meant to go. The absence of questions seemed to ease her more than any performance of hospitality could have. When he turned to leave, she reached into her bag and pulled out cash. Elias hesitated only a second. "Or in the morning?" She studied him, perhaps weighing whether this was pity disguised as courtesy. Then she nodded once and tucked the money away. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head and stepped back into the corridor. Ranger remained at her door for another moment, then returned to Elias's side. They crossed the yard to the main house under the porch light's yellow spill. The night beyond it looked deeper now, but less empty. Elias paused halfway to the porch and turned back. A rectangle of warm light glowed through room 1's curtain. That single sight lodged in him with extraordinary force. Not because it was dramatic, because it was exact. A room he had scrubbed and repaired now held a living person safe from the road, the cold, and whatever private ache had kept her driving so late. The old Mercer place was not a dream tonight. It was functioning. One room, one stranger, one porch light. He stood there too long. Ranger sat beside him in the gravel, looking the same direction. Elias thought of Gideon Pike and his practical scorn, of Wes's warnings, of Mabel's kitchen roof, and her matter-of-fact reverence for shelter. He thought of the old note in the hardware store. He thought of his mother ladling soup into bowls for travelers she would never see again. Of his father fixing a jammed door at midnight because someone had to sleep behind it before dawn. Inside room 1, Claire Donnelly moved once, her shadow passing briefly across the curtain. Not every life changed in a flash. Sometimes all that happened was this. A woman on a dead road saw a light, and because it was there, she did not have to keep going until she broke. Elias went back inside the house and did not sleep for a long time. Not because he was anxious, because his mind refused to stop circling the fact that what he had imagined in theory now existed in wood, cloth, heat, and witness. He sat at the kitchen table with a cooled cup of coffee and the legal pad before him. But he did not add numbers. Instead, he wrote only 3 words at the top of a blank page. One room mattered. In the morning, before dawn had fully broken, he heard movement outside and looked out the window to see Claire already standing on the porch of the lodge in her coat, face turned toward the lake. The weak early light sharpened the angle of her cheekbone and silvered the loose strands in her hair. She looked less tired than the night before, though not lighter. Some burdens stayed with a person no matter where they slept. When he stepped outside with coffee in 2 mugs, she turned. "I didn't want to wake anyone," she said. "You didn't." She accepted the mug carefully, warming both hands around it. Up close in the clear morning, her eyes were gray, not soft gray, but the color of winter water. They were the eyes of a woman who had endured disappointment without making a religion of it. "Once I used to stop at places like this when I was a kid," she said after a moment, "before everything turned into chains and keypads and plastic breakfasts." Elias looked out at the lake. "This isn't exactly much of a business." "That's not what I meant." He let the silence settle. It felt respectful, not awkward. When she finally paid him, she left more than he would have asked, and did not argue when he returned part of it. Then she hesitated, glanced once at Ranger, and said, "For what it's worth, I hope you keep the light on." By the time a tow truck from town came for her car, the sun had risen clean over the trees. Claire thanked him once more, nodded to Ranger as if to an equal, and drove away behind the tow operator without looking back again. The yard fell quiet, but not empty. Elias stood on the porch of the lodge a long while after the road had cleared, staring at the room that had held a stranger for one cold night, and by doing so, changed something in him that numbers could not. Or one night did not prove a future, but it proved enough. That evening, when dusk began its slow descent over the lake, Elias stepped onto the porch before the dark had fully gathered, and without hesitation this time, he turned on the light. The weather changed before Elias Mercer admitted it had. Not in the simple way of colder mornings or a sharper edge in the air, though those came too. It changed in the weight of the wind, in the way the pines no longer whispered above the lodge, but spoke with a harder mouth, sweeping across the lake and striking the old building's broadside as if trying to remember which weaknesses belonged to them. By late afternoon, the sky had gone the color of scraped metal, and the light over the Mercer property thinned into something brittle. Elias spent most of that day finishing a repair job at a feed shed outside town, replacing a hinge assembly and reinforcing a warped sliding door while Noah Pike held tools and tried not to ask too many questions. Noah had grown better with his hands over the last weeks, but he was still too quick with assumptions and not yet quick enough with judgment. But he no longer moved like a boy waiting to be corrected before every task. His shoulders were beginning to square without him noticing. He listened more, fumbled less. There was a seriousness to him now that had not been there when he first showed up in a faded hoodie and all the defensive slouch of somebody half expecting to be turned away. They drove back with the bed of Elias's truck rattling under salvaged lumber and leftover brackets the shed owner had let him keep. Ranger sat in the cab between them, alert but quiet, his sable coat catching the weak light in stripes of cream and charcoal, one ear angling now and then at the changing note of the wind. Elias had learned to trust that more than weather reports. By the time the lodge came into view, the first gusts had already started testing the property. The porch light was on. Elias had fallen into the habit of lighting it before dusk, even when no one was expected. It made the place look less abandoned to passing eyes and less uncertain to his own. The sign still leaned. The back rooms still needed work, but there were now 2 rooms fit for use, a front entry that no longer smelled like shut dust, and one visible promise to the road. Mabel Rowan's station wagon was parked near the main house, its faded green body rocking slightly in the wind. That told Elias more than her presence alone. Mabel did not come out in weather for social reasons. She met them halfway between the truck and the porch, gray cardigan belted tight over a dark wool dress, white hair pinned up but already loosening around her temples. Her cheeks were pink with cold, her eyes brighter than they should have been. "You need to get that east side looked at tonight," she said without preamble. Elias set the lumber down. "Why?" "Because it sounded wrong." She pointed with one gloved hand toward the long east corridor of the lodge. "I was in room 1 changing out the towels from that woman the other night, Claire. Nice posture, sad eyes, and the wall shivered, in a way walls aren't supposed to." Noah glanced toward the lodge, then at Elias. The wind struck again just then, harder. Somewhere overhead something knocked once, dull and hollow. Elias felt it in his stomach before he thought it through. Wes Gannon had warned him that the east side roofline worried him. Not enough for immediate closure, not yet, but enough to put it high on the list. High on the list had not been the same thing as affordable. So Elias had done what exhausted men with limited money often did. He had promised himself he would get to it before it became urgent. Now urgent had come looking for him. "Lantern," he said to Noah. "And the pry bar." The three of them crossed the yard with Ranger moving a half step ahead, head up, body taut with attention. Inside the east corridor, the air felt subtly different, colder, yes, but also unsettled, as if the building itself had begun listening too hard to the weather. Elias stood still for a long moment, letting the place speak in all the ordinary ways old structures did. A seam ticking under pressure, a soft complaint from the rafters, a loosened panel shifting by fractions. Then the wind hit broadside. A tremor moved through the corridor wall, not dramatic enough to throw anything down, but unmistakable. Noah looked at the ceiling. Mabel's mouth tightened. Elias knelt near the baseboard on the outer wall, pressed his fingers against the trim, and felt the faint give beneath. Not surface damage. Something deeper. He moved to the service access he had meant to open a week earlier and used the pry bar to loosen the panel. After cold air breathed out of the cavity along with the stale smell of old damp, insulation, and wood that had been holding on by politeness more than strength. Noah lifted the lantern higher. The beam caught the truth in pale strips. Part of the support member along the eastern run had darkened and softened where moisture had worked at it over years. Not fully gone. Not yet. But bad enough that the repeated pressure of wind and winter could turn it from weakness into failure. A section of cross-bracing farther back had been repaired badly at some point, maybe long before Elias left for the Navy. Enough to hide the problem. Not enough to solve it. He sat back on his heels. Mabel did not ask the question immediately. She had known him too long to rush a man already losing the argument with reality. When she finally spoke, it was quiet. "How bad?" Elias looked up at the ceiling, then at the two completed rooms at the end of the corridor. But he thought of Claire Donnelly sleeping in one of them with road fatigue still in her bones, thought of the porch light, thought of anyone else arriving in weather and trusting the structure because he had left the door unlocked and the lamp lit. "Bad enough," he said, "that I can't let anybody stay on this side until it's fixed right." The sentence felt like swallowing nails. Noah shifted his weight. "Can you fix it?" Elias stood slowly. "Not tonight." The disappointment that crossed Noah's face was young and honest. He hid it quickly, but not quickly enough. To him, the lodge had been becoming a thing through effort, and effort, at 19, still seemed to promise a fair bargain with outcome. Mabel read the room more accurately than either of them. "You should eat before you decide to hate the world," she said. "Makes for a more disciplined bitterness." Normally, Elias might have deflected, and instead he followed them into the main house, because the cold in his hands had settled somewhere deeper, and he knew enough now to fear the decisions he made while empty. They ate at the kitchen table with the wind fingering the window frames and the porch light throwing a small gold patch onto the gravel outside. Mabel had brought venison stew thick with potatoes and onions. Noah ate too fast at first, then slowed under one look from her. Ranger lay near the door, but did not fully settle, lifting his head each time the gusts rose. No one talked about the corridor for several minutes. When they finally did, it was Noah who broke first. "What if you just close those rooms till spring?" Elias looked at him. "And do what with people if they come through before then?" Noah dropped his eyes to the bowl. "I don't know." Neither did Elias. That was the problem. Elias stepped outside alone to look again at the east side from the yard. The porch light cut a narrow wedge through moving air, and beyond it the lodge stood half-shadowed, the siding shivering almost invisibly under each hard gust. He moved farther out, boots sinking slightly in damp ground, trying to judge the line of strain from the outside. Then Ranger came off the porch at a dead run. Not barking, not panicked, fast. The dog crossed the yard and slammed his shoulder hard against Elias's thigh, with enough force to stagger him sideways just as a sharp crack split the air above them. A length of loosened fascia board tore free from the east edge and struck the ground exactly where Elias had been standing, splintering across the wet gravel. For one raw second, everything held still. The board rocked once and settled. Elias's pulse punched through him so hard it blurred his hearing. Ranger remained in front of him now, square and braced, eyes on the roofline. Not dramatic, simply ready. Mabel had come to the porch. Noah was behind her, pale under the porch light. "Lord above," Mabel said softly. Elias bent, picked up the broken strip of wood, and felt how rotten the back edge had gone. He looked from it to the roof, to Ranger, to the ground where his body had almost been. No ghosts, no miracles. Just a working dog that had read the danger half a breath before it arrived. Still, the moment entered him like judgment. Because there it was, plain and undeniable. His stubbornness had already passed the point where only his own body was at risk. The lodge could hurt people now. That changed everything. They secured what they could for the night with rope and temporary bracing under lantern light while the wind worried the trees and the cold crawled steadily deeper. Noah climbed where Elias told him. No argument, no bravado. Mabel held the light and cursed at the weather with an inventiveness age had only refined. Ranger tracked each movement, pausing sometimes at the corner posts, as if monitoring whether the whole thing meant to stay upright. By the time they were finished with the emergency patch, Elias's shoulders burned and his gloves were soaked through. He stood in the corridor afterward, breath steaming faintly in the colder air, now seeping through every hidden weakness, and understood something he had been avoiding for weeks. Good intentions had run out of room. This was no longer a matter of patching what he could at night and trusting determination to close the distance. The east side needed real work. Structural work. Material he could not salvage from closets or buy one box at a time without consequence. The kind of job that swallowed money and left men standing in hardware aisles trying to calculate whether pride could be hammered into load-bearing support. The next morning, Wes came early after Elias left a message before dawn. He inspected the opened wall, the corridor line, the damaged edge outside, and then stood in silence long enough to make Noah visibly anxious. Finally, he said, "You can save it." Elias exhaled once. Wes held up a hand. "Don't get grateful too soon. You can save it if you stop pretending this is a side project and treat it like a structure that might kill somebody if you romanticize it." That stung because it was true. Wes crouched, tapped the compromised beam with 2 knuckles, and explained what had to happen. Sistering supports, replacing the rotten section, not dressing it, pulling back more of the outer run than Elias had hoped, reinforcing before the deep cold set in. There was no version of it that was cheap. Noah listened hard, lantern in one hand, though daylight already filled the corridor. Mabel stood near the office door, with her arms folded so tightly her knuckles showed pale. When Wes finished, the figures sat between them like a second weather system. Elias did not speak right away. He could sell the place. Gideon Pike would buy it, or somebody like him. But there were easier ways to fail than this cleaner, at least. He felt that thought enter him, and hated how sensible it sounded. Mabel must have read some part of it in his face, because after Wes left, and Noah went out to stack the temporary bracing wood, she came into the main house kitchen, carrying her handbag clutched close under one arm. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I may have been stupid." Everyone interesting is stupid in at least one important direction. "This isn't about interesting." "No," she said. "It's about whether you want to quit before the thing has had a chance to become bigger than your fear." He looked away. Mabel set her bag on the table, opened it, and took out a small tin box painted once with flowers now mostly worn away. She pushed it toward him. "What's that?" "My savings." "No." "Yes." He didn't touch the box. "Mabel," she cut him off with a look sharp enough to trim wire. "I am too old for people to waste my time with false nobility. I'm not handing you a fortune. I'm handing you what I can spare because I know what a roof means when night comes early." He stared at the tin. Her voice softened then, but only slightly. "That room you gave the lady the other night?" She stopped by this morning before heading south with the tow man. Left a note for the lodge. Said to keep the light on. Mabel's fingers rested briefly on the table's scarred edge. People remember when a place receives them before it judges them. Something in Elias tightened painfully behind his ribs. By afternoon, others began arriving. Not a crowd. This was not the sort of story real life usually allowed. But one by one, in the sober way useful things happen, they came. The retired bus driver whose porch Elias had repaired brought spare treated boards from his barn loft. The owner of the rental cabin sent over rolls of insulation he had stored dry in plastic, as a man Elias barely knew from the feed store dropped off a box of exterior screws and muttered something about settling favors forward. Even Claire Donnelly, miles from whatever road had first sent her there, mailed back a check with a note that contained only 2 sentences. "For the room that let me stop. Use it where it holds." Noah stood in the yard as the supplies accumulated and looked slightly stunned by the evidence that people could come back. Ranger moved among them all with unassuming authority, accepting brief touches, inspecting each new arrival, then settling near the east corridor as if guarding the idea as much as the structure. When evening fell again, Elias stood beneath the porch light with cold hands and an exhaustion so deep it felt mineral. The work ahead was still daunting, the money still insufficient, the risk still real. But the place was no longer being held up by his will alone. That mattered more than he could yet say. He looked at the east side. At the open wall, the stacked lumber, the patched edge against the bruised evening sky. Then he turned and saw Mabel in the porch chair with a blanket over her knees, Noah carrying braces toward the corridor, Ranger standing watch at the threshold, the porch light burning above them all. The lodge had not been saved. Not yet. But for the first time, Elias understood with total clarity that he was no longer the only one refusing to let it fall. Winter did not arrive with a single storm or a ceremonial first snowfall. It came the way truth often came in the north, gradually. Then, all at once, until one morning a man looked out across the yard and realized the season had already made decisions on his behalf. By then, Mercer Lodge was no longer merely a wounded structure being argued with by weather and stubbornness. It had become something harder to name and easier to recognize. The porch light came on every evening before full dark. The front room of the main house smelled more often of coffee, soap, and wood smoke than of dust. 2 rooms were solid. The east corridor, after weeks of work, no longer shivered under hard wind the way it had before. The sign still leaned a little, and there were still drafty seams in places where old wood insisted on remembering its age, but the property had crossed some invisible line between abandonment and use. Elias Mercer felt that change most clearly in the mornings. He still woke early. That part of him had not softened, and probably never would. But the hours before dawn no longer opened like blank territory. They had shape now. He checked the stove. He checked the weather. He stepped onto the porch with coffee in hand and looked first not toward the road, but toward the lodge, as if expecting it to report to him, as if its continued standing had become a kind of conversation. Ranger always came with him. The German shepherd had grown into the rhythms of the place so completely that Elias sometimes forgot the dog had ever belonged to any other sort of life. At 6 years old, Ranger moved with the contained authority of something built for work and loyalty rather than display. His sable coat thickened for winter along the neck and shoulders, as the cream and gray beneath the darker line of his back catching morning light in muted layers. The black harness with its deep red edging had become as much a part of the landscape as the porch rails and stacked firewood. He checked the drive before dawn. He circled the lodge at dusk. He paused at each room that held a guest. It was not sentiment. It was stewardship. And Elias had come to understand that the dog's faith in the place, however wordless, had preceded his own. The work never truly ended. That, too, became part of the life of it. By day, Elias still took repair jobs around the county. Roof patches, frozen pipes, fence posts heaved crooked by frost, window frames split by old weather and newer neglect. He no longer took every job offered. He had learned, painfully, that there was a difference between generosity and stupidity, and poverty punished men who confused the two. But he kept enough work to hold the place together, enough money moving through his hands that the lights could stay on, the woodpile could stay high, and a stranger could still find clean blankets if the road betrayed them after dark. Noah Pike had become part of that rhythm in a way no one, least of all Noah, would have predicted at the beginning. At 19, Noah was still very much himself, too quick to talk when he was nervous, too proud in the ways of boys who had spent years being underestimated, too likely to arrive with his hoodie half-zipped and his hair refusing all order. But the shapelessness had gone out of him. Work had given his long limbs a clearer purpose. His shoulders had filled slightly from hauling lumber, lifting braces, and learning that using the body well changed more than muscle. His face still carried youth around the mouth and eyes, but there was more steadiness in it now. He remembered measurements. He checked ladders twice. He no longer handled tools like someone borrowing another man's language. He had also, Elias noticed, but begun showing up early, even on mornings he had not technically been asked to. One bitter dawn in late November, Elias found Noah already in the main house kitchen, standing awkwardly over the coffee pot, as if afraid the machine might resent him for trying. Mabel Rowan sat at the table in her blue-gray cardigan and wool skirt, hands wrapped around a mug, watching him with the tolerant severity of a woman who had decided the boy was worth bullying into adulthood. "You put too much grounds in," she told him. Noah frowned into the pot. "You said strong." "I said drinkable. That's not the same thing. He looked over at Elias, who shrugged. You'll survive. Mabel snorted. That, in my experience, is a very low standard for men. Moments like that had become more common. So had the smaller ones. Noah fixing a loose latch without being told. Thus Mabel arriving with jars of preserves and leaving with a list of things Elias needed from town, because she trusted his hands less than his forgetfulness. Wes Gannon stopping by under the pretense of checking the exterior line and then staying long enough to argue with Noah about proper wire routing. Gideon Pike slowing his truck near the drive, no longer with the expression of a man watching someone bury himself, but with something closer to wary recognition. Gideon never apologized for doubting the whole thing. Elias would not have trusted him if he had. But one afternoon, while dropping off a crate of replacement bulbs and 2 still-boxed smoke detectors from an overstock at the motor stop, he stood on the porch of the lodge with his hands in his coat pockets and looked toward the road. You know, this still doesn't make financial sense, he said. Most worthwhile things don't. Gideon's mouth tilted slightly. That sounds suspiciously like something Mabel's been feeding you. Could be. The older man glanced toward room 1, where a weary farm couple from the western ridge had slept the previous night after their truck axle failed in freezing rain. You're not running a motel, he said. No. Not a charity either. No. Gideon looked at him then, sharply, as if measuring whether Elias himself had yet found the word for what it was. Good, he said. Would have hated to see you get it wrong after all this work. It was, in Gideon's language, a form of respect. By then, the fields beyond the road were white, and the lake had taken on that winter stillness that made it seem less like water than a sheet of cold intention. Elias had spent the day repairing a collapsed barn door for a man out east, and came back after dusk with Noah and Ranger in the truck, the headlights tunneling through blowing flakes. And the porch light at Mercer Lodge appeared through the snow like a star seen through old glass, small, imperfect, but impossibly steady. As they rolled into the yard, Ranger stood abruptly in the cab. Not agitated. Focused. Elias shut off the engine and listened. At first there was only wind-driven snow hissing across the gravel. Then, faintly, something else. Not an engine. Not footsteps exactly. More like the hesitant scrape of a boot catching on frozen ground. Noah heard it too. You expecting somebody? No. Ranger was already at the door when Elias opened it. A figure emerged slowly from the white, dark line beyond the porch light's reach. A man this time, wrapped in a heavy coat gone gray with road salt and weather, carrying a duffel slung low in one hand. He was in his late 50s, perhaps older, tall but stooped from cold and fatigue rather than age alone. His beard had grown in rough and white across a face cut with fine, tired lines. More snow clung to his cap and shoulders. One eye looked slightly swollen from wind exposure or poor sleep. The other was clear and searching. He was not drunk, not wild, just worn to the edge where dignity and exhaustion no longer bothered pretending they were separate things. He stopped at the margin of the light, as though unsure whether crossing into it required permission. Ranger moved forward first, not far, just enough to stand at the boundary between porch and storm. The dog's posture was calm, unthreatening, but utterly certain. A gatekeeper who had already judged the matter. The man looked down at him, then up at Elias. Evening, he said, voice roughened by cold and too much road. Saw the light. 3 words, the same shape of need Claire Donnelly had brought weeks earlier, but in another body, another weather, another tired face. For a strange moment, the whole year seemed to compress inside Elias. The empty house when he first returned, Mabel's roof, the note on the hardware board, Noah standing under cracked plaster, the east corridor nearly failing, Mabel's savings tin, the first warm room behind a clean door. All of it converged in that simple sentence spoken by a stranger in the snow. Saw the light. Elias felt something inside him settle with almost frightening clarity, not because the words were magical, because they were ordinary enough to be true. The man gave his name as Arthur Bell, a retired long-haul mechanic driving south to see a sister after heart surgery. Somewhere 30 miles back, his truck had begun coughing, then smoking. He had coaxed it as far as the turnout before admitting defeat to weather and machine both. Arthur Bell had the look of a man who had spent decades around engines and tools, the thick wrists, the stubborn hands, the habit of standing as though braced against things that could fail without warning. Grief had been through him, too, Elias guessed. Not freshly, but permanently. Men who spent years alone on highways carried it in particular ways. Elias brought him in without performance. Noah took the duffel. Mabel, who had stayed late that evening because the snow made the road untrustworthy, disappeared into the main house and re-emerged with soup in a covered pot, as if old age had finally granted her the right to read Providence as a work schedule. Arthur stood just inside the office entry of the lodge and looked around with the polite confusion of someone trying to understand what kind of place he had found. His boots melted small black stars onto the mat. Snow ran off the edge of his coat. "This place open?" he asked. Elias considered the question. He could have answered yes. It would even have been true enough. But the truth that mattered was larger and harder won than a business designation. "It is tonight," he said. Arthur let out a breath that was very nearly a laugh. "Tonight'll do." Later, after the man had eaten and the room door had closed behind him, Noah stood in the corridor with his hands buried in his pockets and looked toward the window where snow still feathered past the porch light. "That's the second one," he said. Elias shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." Noah glanced at him, not understanding. Elias looked toward the road, toward the darkness beyond the light, toward the yard where Ranger now stood with flakes gathering on his back like pale ash. It was not the second one. Not really. There had been Mabel and her kitchen roof, Claire Donnelly and her tired gray eyes, the farm couple from the ridge, Noah himself, whether the boy understood that yet or not, even Gideon, in his own flinty way, circling closer to a place he had once dismissed. The lodge had already become shelter in more forms than a bed and 4 walls. That realization did not make Elias feel heroic. It made him feel small in the right way, like a man allowed to take part in something that mattered precisely because it was not grand enough to be admired from a distance. By Christmas week, the porch light had become a known thing. Not famous, not legendary, just known. A detail passed among truckers, farmhands, 2 old women in the grocery aisle, a deputy who'd once told a stranded driver where to turn if he needed a room and had no luck in town. Mabel began keeping a tin of extra tea packets in the office. Noah fixed the outer handrail before Elias noticed it needed doing. Wes stopped pretending he was only there for technical inspections. Gideon, passing one afternoon, brought over a box of individually wrapped soaps from a supplier error without meeting Elias's eyes. And Elias himself changed in the smallest, most convincing ways. But he laughed more, though rarely first. He slept harder. He no longer stood in rooms trying to imagine what they might become. He stood in them considering what they still needed. He kept the old name on the sign, not because he was trapped in the past, but because he had come to understand that carrying something forward was not the same as living backward. One evening, just after the last flare of sunset had faded behind the black pines, Elias stood beneath that sign with a paintbrush in one hand and looked up at the letters he had cleaned and restored, but not renamed. Mercer Lodge. The wood was still old, the edges still rough, but the name stood clear again against the dark. Ranger came and sat beside him. Behind them, warm light fell across the porch. Inside, Arthur Bell's room was quiet. Mabel's voice drifted faintly from the kitchen as she bullied Noah over his terrible card-shuffling skills, and the stove gave off that low, dependable heat no one noticed until they had once been without it. A vehicle turned in from the road then, headlights sweeping slowly across the yard. Another traveler. Another night. Elias did not tense. He did not wonder anymore whether he was the kind of man meant for this life or the previous one. The question had grown less important than the work itself. He set the paintbrush down, put one hand briefly on Ranger's neck, and walked toward the porch as the car door opened and a tired stranger stepped out into the cold. That was when the answer came. Not as thunder, not as revelation, but as the calmest fact he had known in years. He had spent so long after leaving the Navy believing he needed another mission large enough to justify his strength, another purpose worthy of the damage life had done to him, another arena in which being disciplined and unyielding might mean something. He had been wrong. Sometimes a man did not need a battlefield. Sometimes he only needed a porch light, a sound roof, a door that opened, and the willingness to stand there when somebody came in out of the dark. Elias reached the porch, opened the door, and let the warm light spill wider into the night. Here is an ending message in English you can use. Sometimes the miracle we pray for does not come like thunder from heaven. Sometimes it comes as a small light left on for someone in the dark. A door opened at the right moment, a hand that refuses to give up, or the quiet strength to keep going one more day. God does not always change our lives in one sudden burst. Often He works through ordinary places, tired hearts, worn hands, and simple acts of kindness that become shelter for someone else. This story reminds us that no life is too broken, no season is too late, and no person is too far gone to begin again. No matter your age, your past, or the weight you carry today, there is still a path forward. With faith, with courage, and with God beside us, even the smallest step can become the beginning of restoration. What if this story touched your heart? Please share what it meant to you in the comments. Share this video with someone who may need hope tonight. And if you believe that God can still use ordinary people to do extraordinary good, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories like this. May God bless every person watching, strengthen the tired, comfort the hurting, guide the lost, and fill your home with peace, your heart with hope, and your tomorrow with new mercy.